The forest was still, the kind of quiet that hummed with an underlying menace. It wasn't the peaceful silence that came with solitude, but rather the kind that pressed against you, made you hyper aware of your own breath, your own heartbeat. Lisa adjusted the straps of her backpack, shifting the weight off her shoulders. The trail she'd chosen was remote, deep in the heart of the Cascade Mountains, and stretched nearly 14 miles before looping back to civilization. It was the kind of hike she had always preferred, isolated, untouched, completely hers. She had checked the maps, read the trip reports, no known dangers aside from the usual wildlife, uneven paths, the occasional fallen tree blocking the trail. But she had been hiking for years. She knew how to handle herself. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It had started an hour into her hike. That sensation of being watched, the crawling awareness of unseen eyes, the occasional rustling of leaves that never quite aligned with the wind. At first, she'd told herself it was just her mind playing tricks on her. After all, being alone in the woods was enough to make anyone feel a little paranoid. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger. She paused to take a sip from her water bottle and scanned her surroundings. The trees stood tall and unyielding, their branches twisting toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The underbrush was thick, littered with fallen needles and gnarled roots. Nothing seemed out of place, and yet she couldn't shake it. She heard a snapping twig to her left. Lisa's head whipped toward the sound, her body instantly tensing. A squirrel, maybe. A deer. But the bushes were motionless. A prickling unease crawled up her spine. She forced a chuckle, shaking her head. Calm down, Lisa, she murmured to herself, shouldering her pack once more. It's just nature. She picked up her pace. The sooner she reached the halfway point, the sooner she could turn back. But the further she walked, the worse the feeling got. It wasn't just a sense of being watched anymore. It was a presence, something in the woods with her, something that stayed just beyond her vision, just outside the range of her senses. Every so often, she caught the flicker of movement in her peripheral vision, but when she turned her head, nothing was there. Lisa was no stranger to paranoia, but this felt different. This wasn't just fear, it was certainty. Someone was following her. She stopped suddenly. The world held its breath. Then she heard it. Footsteps, faint, deliberate, mirroring her own. Her blood turned to ice. She spun around, scanning the dense foliage behind her. The trees stood unmoving, their dark trunks blending into one another like a monolithic wall. Hello, she called, trying to keep her voice steady. No answer. The wind stirred the leaves. Somewhere in the distance, a crow cawed. Lisa's fingers curled around the strap of her backpack, her nails digging into the fabric. She had no weapon, aside from the small camping knife tucked into her side pocket. But what good would that do if she couldn't even see what she was up against? She forced herself to keep moving, faster now, her boots crunching against the dirt path. Every so often, she glanced over her shoulder, but the forest remained unchanged. Still, she could feel it, the presence, the heavy weight of unseen eyes drilling into her back. And then came the whisper. So faint, she almost thought she imagined it. A voice said, Lisa. Her stomach dropped. She froze in place, her breath caught in her throat. The voice had been close, too close, and it had said her name. A trick of the wind, that's all it was. That had to be all it was. She forced herself to turn forward again, but now every nerve in her body was screaming at her to run. Her heart thundered against her ribs as she forced herself forward, practically jogging along the trail. The shadows between the trees thickened, the air pressing in around her, suffocating. She didn't know how long she walked before she saw it. a dark figure, standing directly in the middle of the path ahead. Lisa's breath hitched, her body locking up. The figure was too far away to make out any features, but she could tell it was tall and unmoving. Her first instinct was to back away, but something about the way the figure stood, completely still, as if waiting, kept her rooted in place. "Who's there?" she called, her voice barely more than a whisper. And no answer. The figure didn't move. Lisa took a cautious step forward, then another. The closer she got, the more the shape seemed to dissolve, as if it wasn't fully solid. Her pulse pounded against her skin. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. Lisa's breath hitched. She blinked rapidly, trying to convince herself she had imagined it, that her fear had finally gotten the best of her. But she knew better. And then came the whisper again, right behind her ear, that said, "Run." Lisa didn't hesitate. She bolted down the trail, her breath ragged, her vision tunneling. The trees blurred around her as she sprinted, pushing herself past the point of exhaustion. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away. But no matter how fast she ran, she could feel it. The presence, keeping pace with her, toying with her. And then the ground disappeared beneath her feet. She hit the earth hard, tumbling down an unseen slope. The world spun in a chaotic blur of dirt and leaves until she crashed against something solid. Pain exploded in her shoulder as she came to a stop, gasping for breath. The world was dark now. The trees loomed over her, their branches stretching like skeletal hands against the moonlit sky. And then she saw it again, the figure, standing at the top of the slope, looking down at her. Lisa's breath came in short, desperate gasps. She tried to push herself up, but pain flared through her limbs. She was trapped, helpless. The figure tilted its head, and then it smiled. A smile that was too wide, too unnatural. A gaping black maw splitting its face in two. Lisa opened her mouth to scream, but this time she made no sound. Her voice was gone. The last thing she saw was the figure crawling toward her on all fours, moving impossibly fast, its grin stretching wider, wider, until all she could see was darkness. When the search party found her 2 days later, she was lying at the bottom of the ravine, her face contorted in a silent, eternal scream. And her eyes were gone.